A story about the Caliph Stork. One evening, the Baghdad Caliph Hasib was in a good mood on his divan. He dozed off a bit, as it had been a hot day, and now, after his nap, he seemed quite in good spirits. He was smoking a long rosewood pipe, occasionally taking a sip of coffee that a servant poured for him, and every time I could sip my drink, I stroked my beard with a satisfied look. In short, it was clear that the Caliph was in an excellent mood. It was at this hour that he was most agreeable, softer, and more gracious than ever, which is why his great vizier Mansur came to him every day at this time. Here he also came, but he was unlike his usual self. He also came, but he was unlike his usual self, very worried. The Caliph took the pipe out of his mouth for a moment and said, "Why do you look so worried?" The great vizier crossed his arms over his chest, bowed to his master, and replied, "My lord, I don't know if I look worried, but down in front of the palace there's a peddler with such wonderful things that it frustrates me because I don't have any extra money." The Caliph, who had long wanted to please his great vizier with something, sent a black servant down to fetch the peddler. "There's a peddler with such wonderful things that it frustrates me because I don't have any extra money." The Caliph, who had long wanted to please his great vizier with something, sent a black servant down to fetch the peddler. Soon the servant returned with the peddler. He was a chubby little man, with a very gloomy face and dressed in rags. He had a chest that contained all sorts of goods, pearls and rings, richly adorned pistols, bowls and combs. The Caliph and his vizier looked through everything, and in the end the Caliph bought some beautiful pistols for himself and for Mansur, beautiful pistols, and for the vizier's wife a comb. When the peddler was about to close the chest, the Caliph noticed another little box inside, and asked if there were any goods in it. The peddler pulled out a drawer and took out a snuff-box with a dark powder and a piece of paper, with strange writings that neither the Caliph nor Mansur could decipher. "I got these various interesting items from a merchant who found them on the street in Mecca, and they are quite unique," the Caliph said to the peddler. "I know what they contain, and I will sell them to you at the lowest price. I don't need them anyway." A Caliph who willingly collected ancient manuscripts for his library, even though he couldn't read them, he bought the manuscript and the little box and let the peddler go. However, the Caliph was very eager to find out what was written in the manuscript, and he asked the vizier if he knew anyone who could help decipher it. "Kind sir and lord," the vizier replied, "there lives a man near the Grand Mosque, whose name is the wise Selim. He knows all the languages. You should summon him." "He knows all the languages," the Great One calls him. "After all, he might understand these mysterious writings." The wise Selim was soon brought in. "Selim," addressed the Caliph. "Selim, they say you are a great sage. Take a look at this manuscript and see if you can decipher it. If you can decipher it, you'll get a new festive outfit from me, but if you can't, you'll get a dozen slaps, and 2 dozen hits on the heels for calling yourself wise for nothing, and 2 dozen hits on the heels for calling yourself wise for nothing." Selim bowed and said, "Thy will be done, O my lord." He studied the manuscript for a long time and suddenly shouted, "Hang me if this isn't in Latin, O my lord." "So tell me, what does it say?" commanded the Caliph. "Since it's in Latin?" Selim began to translate. "The man who finds this, should thank Allah for his mercy. Whoever sniffs the powder from this box, and while saying mutabor, can transform into any beast and will also understand the language of animals. When he wants to take on human form again, he should bow 3 times to the east and say the same word. However, while transformed, beware of laughing, otherwise the magical word will completely vanish from your memory, and you will remain a beast. When the wise Selim finished reading, the Caliph was beside himself with joy. He made the sage swear that no one would find out about this. He gave him beautiful clothes and let him go. The Caliph then turned to his vizier. "What a truly lucky purchase, Mansour. What fun it will be to become a beast. Tomorrow morning come to me, and we'll head out to the fields together. We'll sniff a little bit from my box and listen to what's being said in the air, in the forest, and in the fields." Caliph Hassan had breakfast. The vizier came. Hassan tucked the snuff-box into his belt. As he was fulfilling the order, the great vizier appeared to accompany him on his walk. The Caliph tucked the snuff-box with the magical powder into his belt and left with the vizier. They walked through the Caliph's gardens, finding no creatures. The Caliph set off on his journey with the great vizier. They went first through the vast gardens of the Caliphs, but in vain did they search for living creatures there. To try out his trick, the great vizier suggested going to the pond, where he often saw many birds, especially storks, which caught his attention with their majestic demeanor and constant chatter. The Caliph agreed to his vizier's suggestion and set off to the pond with him. When they got there, they saw a stork that was walking back and forth in a dignified manner, searching for frogs, and something was chattering to itself. At the same time, they saw a second stork, high in the sky, flying to the same place. "I'm ready to bet my beard on it, my most gracious lord," said the great vizier. "Those 2 long-legged ones are about to have the most interesting conversation. What if we turned into storks?" "They are about to have the most interesting conversation. What if we turned into storks?" "Smartly thought out," replied the Caliph. "But first we need to remember how to become human again." "That's right. Go 3 times to the east and say Mutabor. Then I'll be the Caliph again, and you'll be the vizier. But God forbid we laugh. Otherwise we are doomed." While the Caliph was speaking, the second stork flew over their heads and slowly descended to the ground. The Caliph quickly pulled the snuff-box from his belt, took a good pinch of the powder, and offered it to the great vizier, who sniffed it as well. And both shouted Mutabor, and immediately their legs shrank and became thin and red. The beautiful shoes of the Caliph and his companion became clumsy. And true pause? Their hands turned into wings, their necks stretched out and became elbow-length, the beard disappeared, and their bodies were covered with soft feathers. "You have quite a nice beak, Mr. Great Vizier," the Caliph said, barely recovering from his astonishment. "I swear by the Prophet's beard, I have never seen anything like this in my life." "Most humbly, I thank you," replied the great vizier, bowing. "But I must dare to say that it suits your majesty even more to be a stork than the Caliph. However, would you care to go listen to our companions and find out if we truly understand stork language?" Meanwhile, the second stork managed to land on the ground. He cleaned his legs with his beak, smoothed his feathers, and headed towards the first stork. Both newly transformed storks hurried closer, and to their astonishment, they heard the following conversation. "Good morning, Mrs. Longneck. It's already light on the meadow?" "Thank you, my dear little chatterbox. I was thinking about what to have for breakfast. Would you like a quarter of a lizard or a little frog fillet?" "I'm very grateful, but I really have no appetite today. I came to the Lungu for a completely different reason. My father has guests today, so I'll have to dance in front of them. So I want to practice a bit in my free time. And the young eyes stepped across the lungu, performing jumps. The Caliph and Mansur watched her, but when she stopped on one leg, waving her wings, they couldn't hold back. Laughter burst out, and the Caliph, the first, managed to compose himself. An uncontrollable laughter burst from their beaks, and it took them a while to catch their breath. The Caliph first composed himself. "You can't buy such amusement for any amount of money," he shouted. "It's a pity that those silly creatures were scared off by our laughter, otherwise they might have even started singing." But then it occurred to the Grand Vizier that laughing during the transformation was not allowed. He shared his fears with Caliph. "I swear by Mecca and Medina it would be a terrible joke if I had to remain a stork. Remember that silly word, I just can't seem to recall it." "We must bow 3 times to the east and say Mumu." They turned to the east and began to bow, almost touching the ground with their beaks. But, alas, magic words slipped from their memory. And no matter how much the Caliph bowed, no matter how much his vizier, they couldn't call it out. With that, the word Mumu vanished with a sigh. And poor Hasid, along with his vizier, remained storks just as they were. The enchanted Caliph and the vizier sadly trudged along. They wandered through the fields, not knowing how to help their plight, and they couldn't shed their true form. They wandered through the fields, not knowing how to help their plight, and they couldn't shed their true form. They couldn't return to the city to call themselves either. Who would believe a stork that he is a caliph? And even if someone did believe it, would the people of Baghdad really want a stork as their caliph? They wandered for days, barely eating treats hard to chew with their long beaks. Lizards and frogs didn't satisfy them, fearing digestive issues. Their only comfort was flying, often soaring over Baghdad's rooftops. They were afraid of ruining their digestion with such treats. Their only comfort in this dire situation was their ability to fly, and they often soared over the rooftops of Baghdad, wanting to see what was happening down below. In the first few days they noticed great distress and sadness in the streets, but by about the 4th day, wanting to see what was happening down below. In the first few days they noticed great distress and sadness in the streets, but by about the 4th day, after their transformation, they were sitting on the Caliph's palace when suddenly they saw a grand procession down in the street. The sound of trumpets and drums filled the air. After their transformation, they were sitting on the Caliph's palace when suddenly they saw a grand procession down in the street. The trumpets and drums were sounding. On a beautifully decorated horse sat a man in a gold and purple embroidered kaftan, surrounded by a shining entourage. Half of Baghdad was running after him, and everyone was shouting, "Glory to Mitzray, the ruler of Baghdad." The storks on the palace roof exchanged glances, and Caliph Hasid spoke up. "Do you have any idea now? Why am I enchanted? This Mitzra is the son of my sworn enemy, the powerful wizard Kashnur, who, at an unfortunate time, vowed to take cruel revenge on me. But hope does not leave me. Follow me, faithful companion of my troubles. We will go to the Prophet's tomb. Perhaps the magic will dissipate in these holy places." They flew up from the palace roof and headed towards the Medina. But flying was difficult. Both storks lacked the skill. "My lord," the Grand Vizier groaned after about 2 hours, "with your permission, I can no longer hold my bladder. You're flying too fast, and evening is already falling. We should find ourselves a place to shelter for the night." Rashid heeded the plea of his servant. Down in the valley, he just spotted the ruins that seemed to offer them shelter, and they flew there. The ruins where they descended to spend the night. It was obviously once a castle. Beautiful columns rose above the heaps of stone, numerous chambers, fairly well preserved. They testified to the former splendor of the building, looking askance at their companions, wandering through the galleries in search of soups and places. Suddenly, the stork Mansour stopped my lord, and the ruler babbled he barely audibly, although great. It is fitting for a vizier, and even more so for a stork, to be afraid of ghosts. However, I feel a chill, because nearby something is clearly sighing and moaning. Now the Caliph also stopped, as he too distinctly heard a quiet moan, more human than animal, full of hope. He rushed toward the direction from which the moans were coming, but the vizier grabbed his wing with his beak and pleaded tearfully, "Don't rush into new unknown dangers." But it was in vain, for beneath the stork's feathers the Caliph's brave heart was beating fiercely. He broke free, sacrificing a few feathers, and dashed into one of the dark passages. Don't rush into new unknown dangers, but it was in vain, for beneath the stork's feathers the Caliph's brave heart was beating fiercely. He broke free, sacrificing a few feathers, and dashed into one of the dark passages. Soon he found himself in front of a door that seemed to be only ajar, from which the moans and soft whimpers were coming. He pushed the door with his beak, and in confusion he froze in the doorway of the half-destroyed chamber, where a scant light was falling. Through the barred window he saw a night owl sitting on the floor. Abundant tears were rolling from her big round eyes, and hoarse moans were escaping from her crooked beak. But upon seeing the Caliph and his vizier, who had managed to sneak in here as well, the owl let out a joyful hoot. Gracefully wiping away a tear with her speckled brown wing, to the astonishment of the Caliph and his vizier, she screeched in a human-like voice in pure Arabic, "Welcome, gentlemen storks." "Welcome, gentlemen storks. You are a good sign for me that my salvation is near, for through the storks great happiness will come to me, as I was once foretold." When the Caliph came to his senses from the astonishment, he lowered his long neck, positioned his slender legs gracefully, and spoke to the night owl. "Judging by your words, we have found in you a companion in misfortune. But alas, you hope in vain that we bring you salvation, and you will soon realize our helplessness when you hear our story." The night owl asked him to tell her everything, and the Caliph began to recount the story that we already know. When the Caliph shared his story with the owl thanked him and said, "Now listen to my story, and know that I am no less unfortunate than you. My father is the ruler of India. I am his only unfortunate daughter. I am called Luz. That same wizard Kashnur, who enchanted you, has brought trouble upon me as well. He once came to my father to ask for my hand for his son, Mitsri. But my father is a man of whims. He ordered to bring him down from the stairs. The villain managed to sneak up on me in another guise, and when I wished to quench my thirst with a refreshing drink in my garden, he, disguised as a servant, brought me a drink that turned me into this hideous monster. When I lost consciousness from fear, he brought me here and shouted in my ear with a terrifying voice, 'Stay here, you monster, despised even by beasts for the rest of your days, or until someone willingly wishes to make you their wife, even in this repulsive form. Such is my revenge on you and your arrogant father.' Long months have passed since then. I live alone and sadly abandoned by everyone. In these ruins, blind by day, only moonlight lifts the veil from my eyes. For I am blind during the day, and only when the pale light of the moon illuminates these ruins does the veil lift from my eyes." The owl finished and wiped her eyes with her wing again. for the tale of her sufferings brought forth new tears from her. While the princess was telling her story, the Caliph was deep in thought. "Or I don't understand anything," he said. "Or there is a secret connection between our misfortunes, but where can I find the key to this riddle?" The owl replied to him, "My lord, I have that same feeling, for once in my early youth, a wise woman predicted to me that great happiness would come to me through a stork, and I think I know a way for us to be saved." The Caliph was very surprised and asked, "What is this way?" "And it seems to me that I know a way for us to be saved." The Caliph was very surprised and asked, "What is this way?" "The wizard who brought misfortune to both of us comes here every month. There is a hall not far from this room. There he usually feasts with a large company. I've eavesdropped on them more than once. They tell each other about their vile deeds. Perhaps this time he will say the word that you have forgotten." "Oh, priceless princess," the Caliph shouted. "So tell me, when does he come and where is that hall?" The owl paused for a moment and then spoke. "Don't be angry with me, but I can only fulfill your wish on one condition." "Speak, speak," shouted Hasib. "Command me, I am ready for anything." "The thing is, I would also like to be freed. But that's only possible if one of you takes me as his wife. Only if one of you takes me as his wife." The storks were apparently so taken aback by such a proposal, and the Caliph nodded to his servant to come out of the room with him. "Great Vizier," the Caliph said from behind the door, "it's not a pleasant matter, but we could still agree." "Oh, really?" he replied. "So that my wife, when I return home, will gouge out my eyes? Besides, I'm an old man, and you're a young man, and single. Rather, it is you who should marry the young one, and to the beautiful princess." "That's just it," sighed the Caliph, sadly lowering his wings. "Where did you get the idea that she is young and beautiful? This is called a blind deal." They continued to persuade each other for a long time, but in the end, when the Caliph saw that his vizier was more willing to stay with the storks than to marry the owl, he decided to fulfill the conditions himself. The owl was quite pleased. She revealed to them that they had arrived at the most opportune time. Most likely the gathering of wizards will take place that night. She left the room with the storks to lead them to the hall. They walked for a long time through the dark gallery, until a light suddenly shone at them from a half-ruined wall. When they got closer, the owl instructed them to be quiet. Through the opening in the wall next to which they stood, they could see the entire vast hall. It was adorned with columns and beautifully decorated. A multitude of colorful lamps replaced the daylight. In the middle of the hall stood a large round table, laid out with exquisite dishes. Around the entire table there was a sofa on which 8 people were sitting. In one of them, the storks recognized the very messenger who sold them the magical powder. The neighbor at the table asked him to tell his latest escapades, and he, along with the others, he also told the story of the Caliph and his vizier. "What word did you give them?" asked one of the wizards. "A very difficult Latin word, mutabor." Hearing this, through a crack in the wall, the stork and the prime went crazy with joy. They rushed to the exit from the ruins so fast as their long legs could carry them, and the owl could barely keep up with them. Bursting outside, the Caliph emotionally said, addressing the owl, "Savior of my life and life of my friend, a sign of eternal gratitude for what you have done for us, let me be your husband." Then he turned to the east and bowed 3 times. Both storks stretched their long necks towards the sun, which was just rising over the mountain range. "Mutabor," they shouted. In an instant they turned into humans, and filled with great joy from their newly granted life, the master and the servant, crying and laughing, rushed into each other's arms. But how amazed they were when they looked back. A beautiful lady, elegantly dressed, stood before them. Smiling, she extended her hand to the Caliph. "Don't you recognize your night owl?" she asked. It really was her. The Caliph, enchanted by her beauty and grace, exclaimed that he had become a stork to his happiness. The three of them immediately set off for Baghdad. The Caliph found not only a box of magical powder at his waist, but also a purse full of money. In the nearest village, he bought everything they needed for the journey, and soon they arrived at the gates of Baghdad. The arrival of the Caliph caused great astonishment. He was declared, and therefore the people, very pleased to have found his beloved master again. The more alive, the people's anger flared up against the deceiver Nitsra. Crowds of people rushed to the palace and captured the old wizard along with his son. The old man Caliph sent to the very room of the ruined castle where the princess lived as an owl, and ordered him to be hanged there. To his son, knowing nothing about his father's magical arts, the Caliph offered him a choice, either death or a sniff of something. When he chose the latter, the Grand Vizier handed him a little box. He took a good sniff, and with the magic word, the Caliph transformed into a stork. The Caliph ordered him to be locked in an iron cage and placed in his garden. Long and joyful, there lived Caliph Hasib. The happiest hours for him were those when the Grand Vizier would come to visit in the evening. They often reminisced about their adventures when they were storks. And when the Caliph happened to be in a particularly good mood, he would go so far as to imitate the Grand Vizier in his form. The stork walked majestically across the room, not bending its legs, cracking sounds, waving its arms as if they were wings, and he showed how generous he was, bowing to the east and calling out, "Mumu." The performance always entertained Lady Caliph and her little ones quite a bit. But if the Caliph talked too long, and bowed and shouted, "Mumu," the Vizier, smiling, threatened to tell Lady Caliph about what the argument was about outside the Night Owl Princess's door. At that, the Caliph furrowed his brows in anger, and the Vizier immediately fell silent. "Mumu," the Vizier, smiling, threatened to tell Lady Caliph about what the argument was about outside the Night Owl Princess's door. At that, the Caliph furrowed his brows in anger, and the Vizier immediately fell silent. So let's not dwell on that any more, shall we?